Okay, and we're back, right? Ethnography and power mapping. So I've got a cough drop in. I've got a bit of a sore throat today, and I've also got more coffee. So let's dive in. Let's do this, right? So we've touched on power mapping quite extensively, though. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth, but I've only mentioned kind of ethnography sprinkled throughout. Okay, very powerful method that can be used in this process. So in the last lecture and in the lecture before that, right, we built our theoretical toolkit, right? We developed these tools for understanding power in our context, right? Now we're going to move from, again, theory to practice, right? We are always moving from theory to practice, right? We're going to go from understanding those frameworks to actually observing power in action using ethnographic fieldwork, okay? But first, I want you to, again, let me guide you on a thought exercise, right? Have you ever been in a meeting? Of course you have. Maybe a student organization, family discussion, work situation, right? Where what was officially happening seemed different from what was really happening. Does that sound wild, right? So maybe someone was officially just asking questions, right? But you could tell they were actually challenging the leader's authority a little bit, right? Maybe the agenda said open discussion, but certain topics seemed off limits, right? They're, whoa, I don't want to go there. Maybe someone wasn't talking much, right? But everyone else kept glancing at them before they were speaking. That experience is recognizing power operating through everyday interactions in ways that aren't always visible or official, right? That's exactly why we need ethnographic methods for power analysis, right? Power doesn't just exist in policy documents or interview responses, it operates through everyday practices, social, spatial arrangements, body language, timing, all the subtle interactions that shape outcomes but often escape explicit attention, right? So again, I gave you an example of that, but let's think about an environmental justice example, right? A community meeting about urban development. A survey might ask participants to rate their influence on a scale of 1 to 10. Interviews might reveal who's speaking most often, which arguments are getting accepted, right? But ethnography is observing the microdynamics that surveys and interviews miss. Okay, who arrives first and chooses seating positions, right? Whose proposals generate immediate support versus skeptical questions? How are city officials positioning themselves relative to community members, right? Are they sitting on a stage? When certain topics are generating silence or animated, passionate discussion, right? Ethnography excels at revealing these contradictions between formal and informal power, right? The agenda might allocate the speaking time, right? But the ethnographic observations are documenting the interruptions, the eye contact, the spatial dynamics in the room that are creating different levels of actual influence. This matters because power often operates most effectively when it appears absent, as we mentioned, right? Well, that seems like a very difficult phenomenon to study. Yes. Democratic participation processes can mask systemic exclusion. Scientific objectivity can obscure political choices, and collaborative management can actually hide continued domination, right? Ethnography, ethnography makes these hidden dynamics visible and documentable, okay? So by the end of today, I'm going to give you a toolkit of field techniques that can, build the basis for capturing these power dynamics through ethnography that might be missed entirely, okay? So again, I went through this. Why is ethnography great? I should also add that I conducted a near 3 year ethnography in Thailand for my dissertation. It was an incredible experience. I really learned and built my skills through ethnographic methods during this period. And I really, really emphasize if you have the privilege and ability to conduct an ethnography, to do it. It's an incredible experience and an incredible way to conduct science. So there's 5 ethnographic approaches that we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about uh, 5 approaches, and these are one size fits all, right? Different approaches are going to reveal different aspects of the power relationships, and understanding these distinctions is really going to help you choose the right method for your research questions and your available access. Okay. So first we have, participant observation, right? This is classic ethnography, right? You join ongoing activities, you observe power in natural settings. This might mean attending city council meetings, participating in community cleanup events, or observing NGO staff meetings. Okay. The key is the extended presence is allowing you to see patterns across multiple interactions rather than just isolated events. Okay. Single observations can sometimes be misleading, but patterns across multiple observations can reveal those systematic power dynamics. Institutional ethnography follows policies and rules as they move through implementation. Okay. Instead of asking officials, hey, how does this policy work, right? You're observing the policies in action. So, how does an urban tree planting program actually operate when city staff encounter property owners who don't want trees? What happens when environmental justice policies encounter actual permitting decisions? How do community consultation requirements work in practice versus on paper, right? This is revealing gaps between policy intention and the lived reality that document analysis alone is not going to capture, right? Third approach, coffee, discourse ethnography. It's going to focus on language and narratives in natural settings, right? Rather than formal interviews about environmental issues, you can record how people talk during casual conversations, right? Informal meetings, work activities. This is going to capture frames and narratives as they actually circulate rather than as people think they should sound in formal research settings, right? So sometimes when you're conducting an interview with somebody, they're going to do satisficing. They might kind of tell you what they think you want to hear, right? Or they might tell you something that might make them look good, right? This helps to avoid that. People often reveal more authentic perspectives when they're not being formally interviewed, right? Think about when you're hanging out with your friends versus when you're sitting in a class, right? Network ethnography maps information and influence flows through systematic observations of relationships, right? Who talks to whom about environmental decisions? Which relationships are visible and which are hidden? How do ideas and resources move through social networks, right? This combines observation with systematic relationship tracking, okay? You document not just what happens in meetings, but who talks to whom before and after meetings, right? Whose advice gets sought for difficult decisions, and how is this information flowing through informal channels? Multi-sided ethnography follows power connections across different locations, right? Environmental decisions made in state capitals affect local communities. International funding shapes national policies, right? Global markets influence local resource use. This method is going to track these connections through that ethnographic presence in multiple sites rather than assuming local power arrangements are locally determined. Okay, I know that sounds kind of complex, but you're just trying to gather the sort of cascade effects across various contexts, right? I conducted an embedded ethnography, which is not included here. We actually live in the community. Okay, that's like a whole other dimension. Your choice of approach really it should match your research questions and access opportunities. Okay, so refer back to the welcome video in lecture one, where I discussed, broadly research and research questions. Okay, that's the foundation. If you're studying formal decision making processes, participant observation in official meetings is going to be essential, right? If you're studying policy implementation, institutional ethnography is going to provide those crucial insights, right? If you're interested in how environmental problems get understood differently by different groups in like a community, discourse ethnography is great. Most effective research combines multiple approaches rather than relying on single methods. It's a hard lesson to learn. But start with one approach, right? That matches your primary research questions. Then look for opportunities for complementary approaches as access, resources, feasibility allow, right? Don't get in over your head, right? But stay open to multiple perspectives. So let's start with participant observation, right? Reading power in meetings is going to be kind of what we're going to focus this on. So starting with this, meetings essentially are power performances, right? Where everything from arrival patterns to seating arrangement communicates and reinforces power relationships, right? I mean, gosh, this is like evolutionary. This is like biological. Think about, all of that. Anyway, it's too deep. Anyway, systematic observation of meeting dynamics really provides concrete data about how power is operating in these environmental decision-making spaces, right? But you do need to know what to look for, have that predetermined, and how to document it systematically, right? You can't just show up and start riffing. I suppose you could, but I don't encourage it, right? So you're going to arrive early. You're going to look for pre-meeting dynamics. You're going to have looked at the literature and looked at what other people have done, you're going to think about, well, your pilot study that I hope you've conducted. You're going to think about the context and what are you looking to observe, right? Who arrives first? Are certain participants clustering together or maintaining distance, right? Are there informal conversations that are leaving some people out? Early arrivals are often going to indicate investment and influence, not always, right? Sometimes people with stakes and outcomes make sure they're present, for pre-meeting conversations. Clustering patterns are going to reveal maybe alliance structures, right? That may not be visible during the formal proceedings, right? And exclusion can signal marginalization, right? That's going to affect formal participation, right? So it's looking for these nuances, right? It's looking at this visual imagery, right? So you're documenting spatial arrangement. You can use simple sketches. Who's sitting where? You could note that government officials are sitting at the head of the table or elevated position, right? Community representatives might be grouped together, physically separated, right? NGO staff might position themselves as intermediaries in the middle, right? These arrangements are often not accidental, right? If you were planned a meeting or workshop, you think about these things, right? You're communicating authority relationships. It's, designed to constrain or facilitate interaction patterns, right? Even if sometimes it's unintentional. Changes in spatial positioning during meetings is a great indicator of shifting power dynamics, right? Look for temporal, time-based patterns, right? Track speaking patterns quantitatively, right? Count speaking turns, time allocations, interruption patterns, who's speaking first on each topic, who's, you know, interventions are generating immediate responses versus polite acknowledgement, right? How long are different participants speaking before facing interruptions? Make it systematic. Develop a simple notation structure, a coding structure for tracking these patterns. Use arrows for interruptions, underlines for emphasis, question marks for challenges. This systematic documentation is your best friend. As I've mentioned, it's going to reveal the patterns that individual participants might not consciously even recognize, right, when they're in the heat of it. When community members propose solutions, right, do officials request detailed feasibility studies? When officials propose solutions, do they move quickly to implementation planning, right? Are we entrenching this sort of discursive power, right? Whose questions generate substantive responses versus polite deflection? These patterns are indicate whose knowledge and preferences are shaping outcomes, whose ideas are getting treated as serious contributions versus whose ideas are getting treated as public comment that must be acknowledged but not necessarily addressed, right? Document who approaches whom after the meetings, right? What gets discussed in the hallways, if you can, right? And which meeting decisions require additional informal approval. A lot of official meetings might just be ceremonial, right? Where actual decisions occur in the follow-up conversations among key stakeholders, right? Like the COP, these major climate conferences, these major multinational NGO conferences, they often say that the best conversations, the big decisions at the UN take place in the hallways, right? I mean, they say it for a reason. You're looking where real power is operating versus where it's appearing or maybe performing to operate, right? For your use of power mapping, if you're looking at formal meetings or hearings, develop a sample observation protocol that's going to systematically document these power dynamics as you would hypothesize they would occur, right? But again, don't just summarize what was discussed. You're looking to see how this power is operating through these systems within the room, okay? And noting down those patterns. Field notes are another really, really great way to capture power systematically, right? Especially if you're doing a long-term ethnography, keeping a field note journal that is like a template that is systematic, crucial. Effective field notes are going to be your primary data in an ethnographic power analysis or any type of ethnographic analysis, right? And taking good field notes really requires systematic attention to power relevant observations rather than general event description. I learned this the hard way. When I kept an ethnographic journal, I started out just being like, you know, 5 people attended, the mood was good. And then when I went back to read them, I was like, gosh, this is worthless, right? So it takes time to develop these skills, but you you have to practice. You have to be aware of your methodological approach. And when in doubt, just try to make it as systematic as possible and take as many notes as possible, right? You can always sort those out, especially if you're taking them digitally. You can, sort those out through different software and in vivo and other things we've talked about. But jottings are also important. These are brief notes taken during observations, right? So you can develop a shorthand system for, let's say, power relevant observations in our case, right? Rather than trying to write everything down, you could use abbreviations for frequent actors, right? So a government official could be GEO, CL, community leader, NGO staff, right? Note speaking patterns with simple symbols, arrows for interruptions, like I mentioned, underline for emphasis, question marks for challenges. And then, specifically look for quotes that are capturing what you're seeking to understand. We're looking at power dynamics, right? But focus on quality over quantity for this component, right? Emphasize, well, I know I just contradicted myself there, but I would say it takes skill, right? And I would go actually over quantity first, and then reduce to quality in an analysis phase, right? But again, like yeah, don't try to transcribe everything, right? Focus on interactions that are going to reveal what you're looking for, right? And but don't limit yourself just to key big moments, right? And then you're going to transform those jottings into analytical records within 24 hours is the ideal, right? You want your memory to remain fresh, right? Include what's called thick description of context, actors, and interactions, right? Try to get it as detailed as you can because that's going to be really useful when you're going back to do analysis 2 years later. But focus on your specific line of inquiry, right? So for us, we would focus specifically on the expansion of power relevant observations rather than comprehensive event documentation, right? If somebody's coming to the meeting, like in an episode of Parks and Rec, and is mad that they found a sandwich in the park, they ate it, and they got sick, right? You don't need to document that, right? You might want to document because it's quite funny. But anyway, a 3 hour meeting, it might generate 10 pages of notes, right? But again, stay true to your topic, stay true to your line of inquiry, and then just summarize afterwards. Quality analysis of key interactions is going to be more valuable than like being like a court stenographer, right? Focus on skills in developing consistent observation categories that you are specifically interested in, right? In these types of power dynamics, right? So verbal interactions include not just the content, but the tone, the volume, the response patterns, right? Who's speaking with confidence versus hesitancy, right? Whose statements, as we mentioned, are generating follow up. Non-verbal communication, eye contact patterns, posture changes, gesture use. Are certain participants avoiding eye contact with officials? Do officials display boredom or attention? They're looking at their phone, right? Resource displays include, clothing, technology, transportation, other material that are, trying to show status and capacity. Government vehicles, professional materials, right? This is all flexes of power, right? Document timing. Who's controlling the meeting space? When are breaks occurring? How long do different topics receive attention? These are showing how priorities are being shaped. And then, try to write analytical memos on a somewhat regular temporal basis that are going to synthesize these observations into patterns rather than just event descriptions, right? Especially if you're doing like a long-term ethnography, right? What reoccurring dynamics are appearing across multiple events, right? Which predictions are confirmed or challenged by your attendance to these meetings, right? What new patterns are emerging that you weren't expecting or the existing theory is not capturing, right? These memos will become the foundation for systemic analysis that's going to go beyond just descriptive or theoretical insights, okay? So because this is difficult, right, in any sort of space, I highly recommend using your phone for field notes or, like a voice memo immediately after an observation. Obviously, you don't want to be in a meeting talking into a microphone, but, technology again is your friend here. But the key is consistency, like a template, right? That's going to generate comparable data across multiple observations rather than impressionistic accounts of individual events, right? We're trying to get comparable data that is systematic, okay? So let's talk about network analysis. This is interesting. I know some colleagues who have done this. I think it's fascinating. Power mapping is very good at visualizing relationships and resource flows that can shape, like, for instance, conservation outcomes, right? But effective maps require, again, I'm a broken record, systematic documentation of both formal organizational structures and informal influence networks, okay? The goal is to reveal the actual power arrangements rather than the assumed relationships, okay? Formal organizational charts, they don't capture how influence actually operates. Informal networks can be invisible if you don't do systematic investigation, right? So begin with formal network analysis through an organizational research chart collect that, policy documents, who's reporting to whom, what are official consultation requirements, etc. This is your baseline for understanding those intended power arrangements, right? And then you can compare that with what you actually see, the observed patterns, right? Document informal networks through this systematic observation and strategic inquiry, right? It's just gonna help build a foundation. You're going to track these patterns across multiple events and contexts. That's the goal, right? Rather than just relying on a single observation. Look at meeting attendance, look at email communications, casual conversations, whatever you have access to, right? What's ethical? Track what I don't mean what is ethical. Do what is ethical, do what is in your IRB. But try to get as many diverse data sources as possible and depending on your type of analysis, right? Track how different types of resources are flowing across network relationships. Money reveals funding dependencies and influence patterns, right? Who's funding whom? What conditions come with funding? How do financial relationships shape policy positions and advocacy strategies, right? Information shows who's getting access to data analysis and early warning, maybe about policy changes, who's getting information first, who gets excluded, right? Expertise is looking at that discursive power, right? Whose knowledge gets valued and incorporated in decisions, who's consulted for technical advice, whose expertise gets cited in the documents, right? Who's How do knowledge networks shape problem definition and solution design? Legitimacy, critical, flows and shows whose endorsement matters for successful implementation, right? Whose support do policymakers seek? Which organizations provide credibility to policy positions? You're going to try to draw that, sketch that, mark that down. You're going to try to draw it into a visual map using, systematic conventions. You're going to use different shapes for different actor types, circles for government agencies, squares for NGOs, triangles for community organizations, maybe diamonds for private sector actors. You can vary these by size and resource capacity, decision-making authority observed, other relevant power indicators. And then you could use line thickness to indicate the relationship strength and arrows to show the resource flow directions, right? Think about digital tools, Marathi, Canva, Gephi, Cytoscape, right? Kumu, Palladio. What crazy names all these things have. These are user-friendly visualization tools for beginners, right? And this can be used on your assignment, right? For your power mapping. A visual map really is going to help you to conceptualize that formal organizational analysis with that, hypothesized empirical documentation, okay? You can also do ranking. You can conduct influence ranking exercises. You can ask participants to rank, right? There's so many uses for this this work. You can do, communication frequency tracking, decision pathway tracing, a lot of really interesting stuff here. Spatial and temporal dimensions of power, super important, right? Power operates through space and time in ways that often escape explicit attention, but profoundly shape outcomes. Spatial and temporal analysis provides concrete documentation of these, very subtle and significant dynamics, right? Location choices, timing decisions, and duration patterns all communicate power relationships and can systematically advantage some stakeholders while disadvantaging others, okay? Meeting locations can often communicate whose convenience matters and whose authority is being acknowledged, right? Are community meetings held in villages, government offices, or hotel conference rooms many miles away, right? Each choice is sending a different message about power relationships, right? Make it systematic. Document this is accessibility systematically, transportation costs, travel time for different participants, language interpretation availability, childcare provisions, wheelchair accessibility. These practical arrangements can systematically exclude some of the most important voices from participation, right? Government agencies will often occupy central, imposing buildings that require security clearances for access, right? NGO offices might be more accessible, but still marked by professional decor that can intimidate community representatives, right? Like, for instance, environmental justice organizations might meet in community centers that are accessible to residents, but less impressive to policymakers, right? Corporate offices might be located in business districts that are difficult to reach by public transportation. When conservation decisions involve site visits, document, whose sites are getting visited, who's controlling those visits, right? Site selection and tour routes can systematically shape policymaker perceptions. Ask yourself, do decision makers visit multiple sites representing different perspectives, or do they rely on curated experiences, right? Is this like a Disney ride on wheels, right? Are we at Epcot Center? How are spatial experiences influencing subsequent policy discussions, right? Look for these timing patterns that are going to reveal priorities, power relationships, and when are communities consulted about environmental decisions, right? Is consultation meaningful if it occurs after the decisions are already made, right? No. Urban planning meetings scheduled during business hours or workshops during farming hours. This is excluding working people, right? Track this stuff, right? Track how long different types of decisions take, right? Are these taking months or years? Seasonal patterns, right? That might systematically advantage or disadvantage certain stakeholders, right? Are consultation periods timed to coincide with seasons when certain groups are unavailable due to work or cultural obligations, right? And for the power mapping, try to like hypothesize and include these spatial temporal analyses as key decision or events that you want to look at, right? How did location and timing choices affect participation? Do these patterns reveal anything about whose convenience and capacity are prioritized, right? So there are many challenges. This stock image is so funny to me. It's like we're all pointing at the computer, right? There are many challenges of fieldwork, right? I probably can't go into all of them here, and these lectures have already gone very long this week. But ethnographic power analysis really faces distinct fieldwork challenges that really require strong methodological awareness and practical strategies, right? You need to anticipate these challenges and do your best to improve and plan for them, which will then create better research quality and ethical conduct, right? So access problems are going to be things that multiply when you're studying power because powerful actors can often exclude researchers and marginalized actors may fear participation consequences, right? Try to build multiple entry points rather than relying on single gatekeepers, right? Relying on a single contact who's supplying all your access or all your networking, right? If government officials don't access or if government officials control the access to formal meetings, develop relationships with community organizations that might provide alternative perspectives, right? If NGOs are facilitating introductions to communities, try to establish direct relationships with community members, right? Be strategic, be transparent about research purposes while respecting different actors' concerns about information sharing, right? Officials might worry about criticism, communities might worry about retaliation. Keep these things in mind. Be careful. Language barriers, gosh, are going to extend beyond translation to include different meaning systems, communication styles. Government officials might use technical jargon. Community members might use place-based, terms and cultural vernaculars, right? Environmental justice activists might employ movement vocabulary that does not translate into policy language, right? Work with folks in the community, right? Key informants who understand these meaning systems rather than just trying to interpret these linguistic translations for yourself or relying on sole information sources, right? Spend time learning these key concepts and communication norms. And don't expect everyone to just adapt to academic research or your native tongue, right? You got to meet people where they're at, especially with this kind of research. Again, your education, your nationality, institutional affiliation, funding sources, this all positions you with existing power, right? Are you seen as aligned with a certain group, right? Be explicit about your positioning, right? While recognizing that neutrality is not necessarily going to be achievable or desirable. How is your present changing that interaction, right? Think about this. How do your relationships with different actors evolve over time as well, right? How do your own views change through this fieldwork experience, right? Positionality is critical and so important. Excuse me. And then think about data management and data protocols, right? How are you going to handle sensitive data, right? Consider whether, some information should not be documented, right? Maybe it should be excluded from written records, right? Maybe some things should be off the record. Share preliminary findings with stakeholders and make sure they feel comfortable with it. Incorporate their analyses into your interpretation, right? This is going to improve accuracy while also building trust and potentially reducing harm, right? Take these things seriously. Take these things seriously. Don't make them afterthoughts. So we talked about your assignment already in the previous video. I'm not going to go into this again, but you can check Canvas for those details. Again, I don't expect it to be perfect, but do your best. I also, want to talk about digital tools. We talked about that. We talked about technology, GPS. We talked about all this stuff, right? So I will provide some resources and readings for you. And that will actually be it for this week. Awesome. I mentioned we talk about interviews, but let's save that for another module as this module has already gone on quite long about ethnography. So cool. Thanks for your engagement and participation. As always, you can contact me by email or office hours and reach out with any questions or concerns. Take care.